Now let's discuss one particular ideology that was used to justify the subjugation of native inhabitants during the age of European imperialism. And again, this age of European imperialism, it spans from, of course, Columbus through, let's say, 1900 or the early 20th century. And this is the ideology of quote-unquote civilization. Now, today, we tend to use this word in a neutral fashion. That is to say, it's not value-laden. It's not claiming any particular civilization as superior or inferior or good or bad. But back then, as an ideology, civilization definitely was wedded to ideas of, to use our term, exceptionalism. Okay, so what is civilization as it was employed back then? Well, it's the European belief system that their societies represented the highest stage, an elevated stage of human development. Now, it's not difficult to see how this is connected to this notion of European exceptionalism, so far as it claims that European society has achieved the highest aims of all of the human race, right? And the rest of the races or the rest of the world fall behind the European civilization. Okay? So, what was this belief system in terms of what characterized it, right? In what way, in other words, was it superior? Well, here's some characteristics of being quote-unquote civilized back then. First listed here is this notion of permanent settlement of people, meaning, the formation of cities and towns. And this is contrary to the notion of, let's say, nomadic people. People, as I mentioned, who are hunter-gatherers. They did not permanently settle. They did not establish cities, it was felt, right? Of course, that's a misconception, as we know. But this is the overall imagination held in the European consciousness as they began to explore and eventually settle and colonize the New World. Now, certainly religion looms large here. Christianity. And I mentioned that many of the European people that came to the New World felt that they were ordained by God to do so. Now, this sounds questionable, right, to say the least, in today's world. But think about this in U.S. history itself. You may have heard of manifest destiny. And manifest destiny is the belief that American civilization, American people were God's chosen people to settle the West, right? And what about native peoples? Well, they're not God's chosen people, so therefore it justified their subjugation, as you see westward movement during the 19th century. Okay, so that's manifest destiny. Well, by this time, that is to say, with the westward movement in the 1800s, that's already quite an old belief system. It starts earlier with European imperialism as they colonized the world. What about science? Certainly that's part of being quote-unquote civilized, right? Science, as opposed to, explaining cause and effect that happens in the world based on superstition and the supernatural, right? Culture, well, religion is subsumed beneath culture, but nonetheless, besides Christianity, we could talk about gender customs, as I discussed earlier, right? The belief that men belong in this sphere while women are relegated to the other sphere, right? Certainly language and even refined culture is part of being civilized, right? Poetry, music, and so forth. Now, in terms of politics, what was civilized was centralized government. Now, this is a relatively new innovation in political thought during the early modern period, and certainly it reaches a culmination intellectually with the Enlightenment into the even into the 1800s, right? This notion of republicanism, that is to say, a republic ruled by the people rather than a king. Certainly democracy falls under this eventually. So that's centralized government that is, quote, civilized. Not to mention technology. We recognize the military superiority of Europeans due to, superior military technology, but certainly other aspects of technology, architecture, right, transportation, so forth. These are all innovations that happened in Europe. So therefore, the cumulative result of all this stuff, all put together, marks European civilization as being civilized. Okay? European societies as being civilized. Now, what's happening here is interesting because think of civilization as a grid, if you will, that's imposed upon native society as Europeans began to, quote unquote, discover and explore different native peoples and their societies. They impose this grid upon what they are observing, and therefore they begin to notice that, hey, these people are not, quote unquote, civilized, right? They don't have cities. They are not Christians. They're heathens, if you will, right? They worship nature, and they believe in gods rather than one God. Monotheism, right? They don't know anything about science. They believe in the supernatural, superstition, certainly no refined culture, a chieftain form of government, no superior technology as we see it, us Europeans. Therefore, they are uncivilized, right? So notice what's happening here. Native Americans are, as I mentioned this in the slide, they're being defined by way of negation. What does this mean? By the way, another way to describe this is definition via negativa, okay, a Latin term. But basically this means that you are defining someone or some people by what they are not rather than what they are. Okay, and in this case, as they impose this quote-unquote grid of civilization, you're saying they're not settled, they're not Christian, they don't know anything about science, they're, they have no government, they're not technologically advanced, therefore they are uncivilized. And from there, it's a slippery slope to basically creating this social construction of Native Americans as being savages, right? Being uncivilized is basically synonymous with being a savage. And, according to this discourse or ideology of civilization, if they are uncivilized, then you have a right or a justification to dominate them. Okay, so you can see how this serves as an ideology to justify native subjugation. And indeed, practically all Western imperial systems, including the United States, upon natives native inhabitants in the West, not to mention our colonial endeavors in the Pacific, the Philippines, Hawaii, and so forth. We will impose the ideology of civilization upon the native inhabitants and justify American imperialism in those parts of the world. So this brings us to what natives thought about being called uncivilized, quote unquote, right? Well, let's think about this response given by a Micmac chief. A Micmac was a particular tribe around this time, and it responds to some French traders. And the traders, trying to establish trade with the Micmacs, basically hurled this accusation of the natives as being uncivilized. And when the chief began to consider this, here's how he responded. Quote, "Thou sayest of us that we are the most miserable and most unhappy of all men, living without religion, without manners, without honor, without social order." Notice the term without, right? By way of negation, right? Like beasts in the woods. Well, if thou dost not yet know our real feelings, which us Indians have towards thy country and towards thy nation, it is proper that I inform thee at once. I beg thee now to believe that, as miserable as we may seem in thine eyes, we consider ourselves nevertheless much happier than thou. Thou deceivest thyself greatly if thou thinkest to persuade us that thy country is better than ours. For if France is a little terrestrial paradise, art thou sensible to leave it? And why abandon wives, children, relatives, and friends? Why risk thy life and thy property every year in order to come to our country? We believe further that you are incomparably poorer than we. As to us, we find all our riches and all our conveniences among ourselves without trouble and without exposing our lives to the dangers in which you find yourselves constantly through your long voyages. There is no Indian who does not consider himself infinitely more happy and more powerful than the French. Okay, so to me, that's a very, effective response to being accused of being uncivilized, right? And it shows that the Micmacs have their own definition of what constitutes the good life, right? The European, they felt it was civilization, right? And it, according to that worldview, it elevated them above all other people. The Micmacs began to say, hey, okay, if you're so superior, why are you over here? Because you want to gain items, things through trade that we possess, right? We don't have to make this voyage across the Atlantic Ocean to get what you have. No, it's the other way around, right? And moreover, it's interesting to note here how the Micmac puts most currency in terms of what defines the good life, most currency in human happiness, right? Human happiness rather than material acquisition and being civilized. Okay, so an interesting response, which, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's a very effective response to this notion of being defined via negativa, to use our term.